Nothing's looking good here. I don't know what's going on. All right, we've got to utilize our time. I need all 45 minutes to get through the book of Exodus. Oh, it's getting stronger. Okay, there we go. Before we get into our study of Exodus, we're going to cover Exodus tonight. Brian has opening word of prayer, so we're going to ask him to go ahead and lead that. I would just mention quickly, I went in and saw Dave today. He sounded horrible. Of course, you had to wear a mask to go in there. And in pretty rough shape. Talked to him last night. I guess it just got worse, so he admitted himself, or he went down to emergency and they admitted him. So remember Dave in our prayers. Brian, go ahead and lead us in opening word of prayer and we'll get started.
Our Holy Father and God who art in heaven, we're thankful, Father, for another day that you bless us with and another opportunity that we can come here and study from your word. We pray, Father, that we will be able to glean those truths that you have us. Most importantly, Father, may we apply those things in our lives that we might be a better servant to you. We pray, Father, for Dave as he is in the hospital, and pray that the things that are being done will aid him in improving his health and that he can be back with us at the next point in time. We pray that you give us every opportunity that we can to visit him and help him in his time of need. Again, be with us through the study for these things. We pray in your Son, Jesus.
Amen. Okay. All right. What I'm going to do is, we're talking about how this series is just going to evolve. Open up our Bibles to Exodus. I'm going to start over here tonight on my right, your left, for readers. And how I've got to design tonight's class is I'm going to give you the overview. And as we're going through the overview, then we'll come back and we'll look at the questions that I assigned you guys. And we'll try to get to those questions by 7:30 is the goal. So as we go through the book of Exodus, the first thing that we're noticing here is in the first couple of chapters, and I got some, not all the chapters will do this or the sections that will do this, but I have some readings. So the first reading, and we'll start with Andrew's dad. Are you up for reading tonight?
Yeah, man.
Okay, if you're in, we need Exodus chapters 1, verse 7 and 8. Andrew, I need you chapter 2, verse 23 and 24. Remember, the first two chapters, if you get into the book of Exodus, we know it starts out by saying a new Pharaoh has risen that doesn't know Joseph, the Israelites, and we're going to get a little idea of what transpired with these couple of verses here. So in chapter 1 of Exodus, verse 7 and 8, and it reads,
But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph.
And read the next verse.
And he said to his people, Look, the people, the children of Israel, and more, and mightier than we.
Okay, and we know because of that, they went ahead and made them slaves. And of course, in chapter 2, and Andrew, if you'll just read 23 and 24 for us.
Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob.
Okay, what was that covenant from Genesis? Okay, we've got to get this land promised, right? I mean, they're crying out to God, they're in bondage, and there's going to be a fulfillment of that, and we know what happens in chapter 2, right? We have the birth of Moses comes into play. I just try to make sure I don't get bogged down with each one of these stories, but, somebody just quickly tell me an interesting tidbit about Moses and him being raised and how that all worked out.
By Pharaoh's daughter.
Pharaoh's daughter.
They found him in the basket.
And then who was watching?
His sister.
His sister was watching, and then what did his sister do?
Volunteered.
Sister came up and said what?
Volunteered their mom as their...
Yeah. Do you want me to go find a Hebrew nurse to look after the child? Okay, so he goes and gets his mom. And his mom actually gets to raise him. And that's pretty cool how that unfolds. And then, of course, we get into section of chapters 3 and 4 here. And we're now over to Hannah. Hannah, I want chapter 3 and in verse 7 read. And Nancy, you're going to be in chapter 4 in just a few moments. I got a couple verses for you. What do we have in the 3rd chapter there, Hannah?
And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cries because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering.
Okay, and so being aware of what's going on here, and I just really want to emphasize that because we're going to be looking at some interesting passages as this unfolds. We all know what the way the Israelites were when they did get released. Just be mindful that they're crying out to God, please help us, please help us, please help us. And in the 4th chapter, Nancy, I want you to read verse 19 and in verse 24.
And the Lord said unto Moses in Midian, Go, return into Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought thy life.
Okay, and in verse 24?
And it came to pass by the way in the end that the Lord met him and sought to kill him.
Okay, we're going to make this. That's an interesting passage, and it's found in the book of Exodus that talks about God, he's calling Moses, I want you to free the children of Israel. But yet here's a little verse there that says, God sought to kill Moses. You can't kill Moses. You need Moses. Moses has to free the children. Was God really going to kill him? Why was God going to kill him?
Because he hadn't circumcised his son.
He hadn't circumcised his son yet. And he went ahead and did it, by the way, and fulfilled that, and his wife was upset about that. But it just goes to show you, people seem to think that, well, God needs me. No. God can use you, all right? And God wants us to serve him. But if we have an arrogance about ourselves that God needs me and we can get away with certain things, it's just not going to work. And that goes for any one of us, and that can happen to religious leaders, churches. You need me. No, Chuck, you can be replaced. And, people can get full of themselves. And that's a great lesson. And so we see God is calling Moses to go back to Egypt and free them. Oh, by the way, how did that conversation go when God told Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt?
Well, he didn't want to go because they were seeking to kill him because he had killed an Egyptian and he had fled. Right?
And of course the whole idea of him going back is thinking, they're not going to let the people go. And of course he started making excuses, right? Such as, yeah, my speech, I'm not a good speaker. Get somebody else to do this, and he eventually has Aaron to help him. Okay, then we get to chapters 5 through 12. And I've got I don't have a lot of passages here. I was just going to test your knowledge about the plagues. And let me get a pen here because you guys are really good at this, right? I'll just put the first initial each one of these plagues. And who can remember the 10 plagues, okay? The 10 plagues to get Pharaoh to let the people go. And the first one we have is?
Blood.
Thank you. Next.
Frogs.
Frogs. Flies?
Yeah.
What do we have after that?
Lice?
Lice. Then?
Cattle dying.
The disease of the animals, right? Next?
Boils.
We got boils.
Hail. Locust.
Locust.
Darkness. And then
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
And then death of the firstborn.
Death of firstborn, right? Now that was an interesting one. Let's make that quick point that's found in these chapters here. What was that plague about, guys? What was it? What was the rule?
Passover. Yeah, they had to put blood around the door.
Okay, so you got to stay in your house, right? You got to put blood.
Both sides of the
You got to stay in there, right?
Yes.
And then what would happen?
The Lord would pass over.
The debt would pass over. Oh, Passover. Okay, we need to remember that, right? So that goes for the Egyptians, and it also went for the Israelites too. And what if the blood is there, but they're outside the house?
It would still be, they have to be inside.
They got to be inside, right? And what if you're inside and there's no blood?
He's still.
All right, and of course you know the comparison that's there, right? You got to be covered by the blood. Powerful as far as giving us insight to comparing with us today. All right, so eventually after the death of the firstborn, what happened? What happened after the death of the firstborn? Pharaoh, right? His son dies. Go. Okay, go. So they leave. And what we're leaving, they're leaving Egypt, and you can read 13 through 18. Some interesting thing there's happened, of course, is what happens, what's the first reaction when you face a death? First reaction? Sorrow, okay? After sorrow comes what next?
Anger.
Anger. So Pharaoh was upset. Then he's saying, what am I doing? We're not letting them go. And they go chase after them, right? Let's look at a couple of passages here. I got, did you read, Nancy?
Yeah.
Okay, you've read. Dustin, you got chapter 14, 11 and 12. And since you're right there, Dustin, I'm going to get you to read 30 and 31 in just a few moments. Kayla, 16. Chapter 16, you're going to read verses 2 through 4 in just a few moments. Mallory, you got chapter 17, 2 through 6. Okay? Now this is just going to give us some information. Again, I'm just trying to familiarize you guys with the books for those who are not familiar, and just some passages that you could be underscoring. So let's go to chapter 14 now, verse 11 and 12.
It said to Moses, because you are no greater in Egypt, and you have taken us away time and wilderness. What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness.
Seriously? Seriously? Yeah. We told you. What? You're the one that cried out to God. You know, you're the ones that wanted deliverance, right? And this happens over and over again. What have we said when our first class that we did? Remember, we're in class, obviously number 2 of the 39 books. But we had the introduction. We talked about the benefit of studying the Old Testament books is that what do we learn about mankind? What's that?
They have to change.
Man does not change, okay? And we might scoff at this and just, I can't believe they act like that. Okay, like we never act like this? And lessons need to be learned here. And I also had verses 30 and 31 for you, Dustin. What's that say?
Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power of the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses.
Okay, so remember, they saw the plagues, they saw the parting of the waters, they get on the other side, they complain, and then after that, Dustin reads here, again, that they see, oh, the Egyptian army has been destroyed, oh, we trust in God. You know, so now they're back on track with God, right? Like everything is wonderful and everything is fine, but we know what happens with them. All right, let's go over to the 16th chapter, verses 2 through 4. Kayla.
And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out of the wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not.
All right, so early on we're learning not only about man, but what are we learning about God?
He's testing.
I heard long suffering over here, right? I mean, that's all part of it too. And of course it burned, you know, we're going to read here in just a little bit in the next section when Moses goes up. Now we've often overlooked some of that. Let me go ahead and point that out. We're still not finished reading some from those chapters. But to give you an idea about God and his dealing with the people, and you think God was just a big pushover, you want to complain, that's okay with God. He doesn't mind because he loves you. And wait a second. When Moses went up on the mount, remember, wanted to get the commandments, remember what God said to him? Go back down. Why?
People are...
They made this calf, right? But you know, if you read it carefully, you'll notice, what did God want to do to the people? He wanted to destroy them. And Moses intercedes for them. You know, God just, you know, let's not think that God is this big pushover like he really doesn't care. And a lot of people seem to think at the end of time, God's just going to save everybody. Because we're learning about these Israelites, these chosen ones, to fulfill the prophecy, the plan, the scheme that God had in mind. But let's not think that these Israelites, they had a one-way ticket to heaven. Did they? They didn't have a one-way ticket to heaven. As a matter of fact, we're going to find out that all but 2 of them make it into the promised land. Okay? All right, and so then we had 17, 2 through 6, and that was Matthew.
shall ye test the Lord? But the people thirst there for water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, Why now have you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So Moses cried out to the people, saying, What shall I do to this people? A little more, and they will stone me. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pass before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock of Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and the water will come out, and the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel.
Okay, so this is a very important lesson that we want to remember a little bit later on when we get into the book of Numbers. Okay, and it's the one that we use about authority, right? And people will talk about the subject of instrumental music, and they'll talk about, well, God liked it then, why wouldn't he like it now? Listen, what we try to tell people and what they need to understand is this lesson right here that's being talked about. What did Moses do to the rock here?
Struck it.
Why did he strike it?
God told him to.
Well, God wanted him to do that? You mean God liked that? That he would strike the rock?
Yeah.
What kept Moses out of the promised land?
Striking the rock.
Wait a minute. I mean, he struck the rock and out came water? You mean, well, why didn't God like that?
Because he didn't tell him to do that.
Because God said not to, right? He said, speak to the rock. You say, well, wait a minute. Is God just being wishy-washy? Do you like something? You don't like something? Can't you just make up your mind? The point is, when God says to Moses, do this, you do it. And do it over here this way. Well, I struck it over here, so I guess I'll be able to strike it over. No, you don't have permission. This is why the Old Testament is full of these fundamentals that helps us to teach people about God and about authority that we need to respect. Because throughout biblical history, remember, God has not changed. His law changed. We're not under the old law, we're under the new, but God hasn't changed. People haven't changed, as was mentioned a little bit earlier. So that's pretty powerful. So these were the events that were leading up to Sinai. Well, now we're in 19 through 24. Okay, so let's pop over there. They get to Sinai. Now, let me back up here and show you. This is why I put a map here. Okay? This kind of gives you a rough idea where they were, because they were over here in Egypt, and they crossed the waters, and they're not exactly sure where they crossed the waters there with the Red Sea. There's like 3 or 4 different general areas. But anyways, they cross that, and they head down the peninsula there, so they're down by Sinai, where Moses is going to go up, and he is going to receive the 10 Commandments, okay? And so let's get there, and we're going to be in the 19th chapter now. In the 19th chapter, and we're over to Dan. Dan, if you'd like to read verses 20 through 24, please.
We came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. The Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. The Lord said to Moses, Go down and warn the people, lest they break through to the Lord and look, and many of them perish. And also let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, People cannot come up to the Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, Set limits around the mountain and consecrate. And the Lord said to him, Go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you. Do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them.
Okay, this is interesting. You know, so when God first tells Moses, I want you to go back down, what did Moses say?
Basically, we've got it under control. We've taken precautions where they can't get through to get up here anyway.
So the people have been told. So then why did God say, get down?
Because he knows the people.
People need to be told, man, right? Over and over and over again. We can just sit back, you know, I mean, I know we raising our children just didn't tell them once not to do something, right? You told them over and over again. Repetition is good. It's a fundamental that tells us about mankind in general. But what positive thing do you get out of this from God? What do you learn from God in this?
He gave them a second chance to obey. He didn't immediately.
Okay, it's not like they haven't. It's not like they've disobeyed yet, but
they didn't follow through. They didn't obey immediately. He gave them time to obey.
well, in this particular case, Amy, they hadn't broken through yet, and Moses says, well, I told them, they've been warned. No, go down and warn them again. Okay, but what does that tell us about God?
He knew they
What do you
would.
think, Mal?
I think what Amy's trying to say is that like, God is patient. He's going to give you multiple chances to not fall into the temptation. You know, that was what the warnings are there for, to say, hey, just remember, you know, doing this. Just remember doing this. Like, we do that with Rosetta, even though she's doing it, like, now you remember you still need to keep doing this to give her chances to stay out of trouble.
That's true. It gives them another opportunity. But I think it's more of the idea of God just really loving mankind so much He doesn't want them to be harmed. You know, the idea of giving them another chance, it's almost implying that, well, they broke it. Well, they didn't. They didn't violate, right? I mean, they hadn't come up. They hadn't been destroyed. He's saying, you know, we already told them the boundaries are there. No, go down and warn them again. Or, you know, we would say remind them again, even though they've already been told. Why would you remind them? Because I care that much for them. You as parents told your kids things over and over again because you love them, because you care for them. And of course, like Amy and Mallory were talking about, we know the way, they've got a track record here. And, you know, being mindful of that, look how many times already they complained against God. They're supposed to be trusting in Him. They're supposed to follow Him and be excited about the fact that they're going to the promised land. And all of that. Okay? All right. It's part of our questions, and I'll wait for that. I'll wait for that. So that's why we're giving it a little bit of the Passover treatment, no pun intended. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ten Commandments in our question sheets that I handed out. And please don't forget, the question sheets for Leviticus will be at the back after class tonight. All right, let's get to this next section. All right, we've got 7 minutes left to finish this. In 25 through 31, when Moses went up, did he just get 10 commandments? Okay, got lots and lots and lots of questions, or not questions, commands of God, what was expected out of them. And in this particular case, in 25 that we have here through 31, there's other laws intermingled in there, but really the pattern for the tabernacle, and you guys have been talking about that. Well, Mark did that in one of the Sunday morning classes. Exodus 25, and in verse 9 we're up to Sandy. Sandy, you got 25 in verse 9? We can't stress that enough. Are there New Testament patterns for anything? Can you think of a few New Testament patterns?
Pattern for worship.
Pattern for worship. I like that. Any other patterns? Mark?
Lord's Supper.
Lord's Supper. Any other pattern?
Becoming a Christian.
Becoming a Christian. Absolutely. Any other patterns?
Giving.
Yeah, how you give. You know, there are stipulations for that. So the acts of worship that are there. But those patterns that we're talking about, when you give a pattern, what's the benefit of a pattern, guys? And you think of wives here with sewing. What's the benefit of a pattern, Mark?
Consistency.
Consistency. All right? That when you have the pattern there, there's going to be things that are going to be in common.
You should take the questioning out of it. You should take the guesswork out of it because there's a set way to do it.
Boy, I'm going to tell you something. I mean, you guys use, this time you use cookie cutters? You know, how much thought process do you give into using a cookie? You know, that you just do it, and it turns out the same. Mark?
Well, I mean, you can appreciate, you know, what we're learning here about God. God understands one thing, that a group of people together can very seldom can agree on much of anything. A big shooting point. So, in order to avoid chaos, God has told them exactly what to do.
Right.
And when they did those things, great things happened for them. When they didn't, bad things happened.
That's exactly right. And you know, one thing you appreciate about God is that even with Noah, okay, there are areas of specific and general authority. So within the pattern there were some generals. Like Noah was told to build an ark, right? Specifically out of what? Out of gopher wood, right? But how was he going to cut the wood? Was he got strip? Use tools? Okay. Well, what specific tools? Use whatever one you want. So, brethren, come together. Well, do we have to meet in an upper room? care where you worship. You just come together and worship. Do we have to have padded seats? Look, just decide. Those are some things, Mark, that men, brethren, might not see eye to eye on, the color of the wall, but there is a pattern of coming together, specifics that are there. Yeah, there's some generics there. Sing, didn't tell us how many, right? All right, Lord's Supper, does it have to be on a wooden table? Oh, it doesn't have to be on a wooden table to do that. So you understand those principles, and again, this is what we're learning by going through the Old Testament. So there was a pattern for those things, and the priestly garments that were also there that was expected. And people wonder, why are there garments? Why do people wear garments today in their religious groups? Well, they carried it over from the Old Testament. We don't have any authority to do that, but I want you to know that's where they get it from. Okay? It isn't something they just invented on their own. Then we have various laws, but a number of laws pertaining to idolatry. Stacy, can you read chapter 32 for us? No, not the whole chapter, but verse 7 and 8.
And the Lord said to Moses, "Go, get down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt.'"
And then it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen the people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I'll consume them, and I'll make of you a great nation." God can do whatever he wants. Remember with Moses, you're not going to kill me. Well, yeah, I can come up with another plan. I'm God. And the same thing here, and then Moses intercedes. But you can see how God feels about sin. A lot of people seem to think that this idea about the God of the New Testament is different than the God of the Old Testament. Same God. Well, there wasn't a God of love under the Old Testament. Yes, there was. Same God. Okay? And so what you're seeing here is that God does not like sin. And he never has. And we need to remember that. And that's obviously was exemplified by him having to send his only son to die for sin, which tells us how bad sin really is. In the same chapter, Stace, could you read 21 through 24, please?
And Moses said to Aaron, "What did this people do to you that you have brought so great a sin upon them?" So Aaron said, "Do not let the anger of my Lord become hot. You know the people that they are sent on Egypt. For they said to me, 'Make us gods that shall go before us.' As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, you do not know what has become of him." And I said to them, "Whoever has any gold, let him break it off." So they gave it to me, and I cast it into the fire, and this calf came out.
Okay. Don't you love that story? Moses confronts Aaron. What's going on here? Well, you know the way these people are. And then I told them to give me all this gold, and we threw it in the fire, and out came a calf. Yeah, sure, Aaron. It just popped out there, right? See, that's what happens when people justify sin. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. And you see that all the time. And just outright lying. Or they deceive themselves. People can believe a lie, right? People can believe a lie. And they've convinced themselves that that's all right. Now, with 1 minute left before we get to our questions, is in chapter 40. And the last part of that, Mark, if you'll go ahead and read a little bit here near the end of the chapter, verses 34 through the rest of the chapter, just 34 through 38, please.
Then the cloud covered the tabernacle of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tabernacle of meeting because the cloud rested above it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. When the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle, the children of Israel went onward in all the journeys. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not journey till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was above the tabernacle by day, and the fire was over it by night, inside the house of Israel throughout all their journeys.
Okay, so once they get the law, where are they going? Where are they going? They're heading to the promised land. Okay, so you kind of get an idea of the timeline within Exodus, right? So they're going to be heading to the promised land. And of course, we're going to be reading about what happens when they get there. But when we get to Leviticus, we're going to read a lot of laws, a lot of interesting, people might find boring, but there's just a lot of cool stuff that we're going to learn in that. Okay, in our question sheets, we got 15 minutes left now. Okay? Explain why the book is aptly called Exodus. Okay, we obviously know that. Because they departed from Egypt. They made that Exodus. There are a number of parallels found in this book which, with comparisons, can be made between Israel and Christians. Can you list some of them? And you might just give me some quick ones of illustrating between here and getting down here. And what's some that comes to mind? Amy?
I put the Red Sea in baptism, like they had to cross the Red Sea, just like
I like it. I like it. In other words, that separated them from being in bondage to be freed was due to water. And there was a parallel to that with baptism, is that on this side you're still in bondage, on this side you're freed from that bondage. And the cool thing about that, and I'll just throw this one in, and that is when they crossed the waters, were they in the promised land?
No.
When you came up out of the waters of baptism, were you in heaven? No, you still got to get there. They still had to get to the promised land. We're still trying to get there as long as we're going to be faithful to God, and that's what God wanted them. Any other parallels? Matt?
With the Passover, the blood on the door is kind of similar with the baptism.
Exactly, with our conversion, because if we're covered by the blood, and the only way you're covered by the blood is being baptized into Christ, and of course you can't be baptized into Christ unless you believe and confess and repent. Mark?
I was going to say, God did not tell them exactly when Pharaoh would let them go. So they had to be ready to go. And the same as us today. I
like that idea of always being prepared. I like that one. What does bondage represent? Sin. So in other words, they were in bondage, we're in bondage to sin. We want to be freed from it, and they wanted to be freed from it, okay? And so there's that comparison that is there. There's also the comparison that they cried out to God, right? Which says they couldn't do it themselves. A lot of people today think they can do it themselves by just being a good person. Well, then you're rejecting the grace of God, because God's grace was Him sending His Son, providing the plan of salvation, providing what He did for us. We're to walk by faith. Grace is His part. Faith is our part, doing what He says. Did you have one, Jen?
I've got a few of them here. There was, when they sacrificed the lambs to put them around the door, it was, I think it mentioned no broken bones of the lambs, or no bones broken, which in Jesus saving us, there was no bones broken.
Symbolic again about the certain kind of blood, right?
Yes.
Just not any blood. What do you say, Amy?
I put on each set that there were covenants and promises made to the Egyptians for the promised land, just like there are promises that are made, like if we obey, we get to go to heaven.
That's right. She meant Israel. And so the promises that were made to Israel gave the same thing but they were all conditional, weren't they? This unconditional, people might think that way with the Jews, they're unconditionally get to go to heaven. No, it was conditional upon them being obedient to the Lord, Jen.
And while they're wandering, going down, there was miracles used to, like the rock, the water coming out of the where the apostles in the New Testament used miracles to prove.
Absolutely. I love that one. I love that one because it wasn't like there wasn't evidence to help persuade us. I mean, we look at these Israelites, man, if I see what they saw, I believe too. Well, we have the eye of faith, and we see that these miracles that took place, we believe them that they really did happen. He really did walk on water. He really did resurrect. Nancy did Matt.
Moses, he interceded for the Jews, because there was times God wanted to just wipe them out. And Moses would speak and intercede for them. We have Christ who...
There is that parallel. There is that parallel. Matt, what was yours?
Kind of a little bit of a different track here, but the tendency for the Israelites to get frustrated with hard times. They get hungry. Moses is gone for an extended period of time. It's no different than Christians today. Go through the same struggles and the same difficulties and temptations when hard times come along.
And when those hard times come, we should be leaning on the Lord, not turning against the Lord. I like that. Let's move on. Question number 3. Got 10 minutes left. How old was Moses when he fled Egypt? And how old was he when he returned to free his people?
40 and 80.
I want scriptural proof now.
Acts 7:23. Acts 7:23.
Acts 7:23 and Acts 7 and verse 30, both of them. Who are we talking about here? Who's in Acts 7? Who's doing the talking? Remember the guy who got stoned to death?
Oh, so Stephen.
Yes. So Stephen is giving this great sermon, right? He's going back and talking about all the history, and he mentions specifically about that. and how old he was, and him being 80. An Exodus passage that we have. I don't know if you guys made note of that. Before I read it, did anybody write it down?
Is it 7:7?
7:7. Good one, Amy. He came out and said, and Moses was 80 years old when Aaron was 83 years old when he spoke to Pharaoh. And it's interesting, right? You had Moses being born there in the first couple of chapters, and in chapter 3 he's being called by God. Where did those 40 years go? You know, in other words, it wasn't in detail. And so it just helps us to get an idea what Exodus was all about. And I asked you guys, you already knew this, explain the Passover and how it relates to God's people today. You guys already did that when we talked about the death of the firstborn and that term Passover. How often were the Israelites to remember that?
Every year.
Okay, they were to keep the Passover as a constant reminder of God, what He did for them. Okay.
And it had to be blood of a perfect lamb.
That's exactly right.
You know, and we have.
And we're going to see a lot of that when we get into Leviticus. Really cool stuff when we get into Leviticus. When we read about Aaron's sons being consecrated, you dip in the blood on the lobe of the ear and on the toe, and we read stuff like that and go, what's up with that? Well, I'm going to tell you, there's some very important principles that we need to learn from that, which makes it a profitable study for us. Okay, where in this book do we find how long the children of Israel were in bondage? Where in this book do we find? How long was it?
430.
430 years. And where was that found in Exodus?
Exodus 12, 41.
Exodus 12 and verse 41. Now there's a couple of New Testament passages. Does anybody know where they are?
Acts 7 and 6.
Acts 7 and verse 6. And I want to talk about that one in just a few moments. But what was the other one?
Galatians 3, 16, 17.
Galatians chapter 3. Remember, in Galatians chapter, it's a powerful passage where Paul goes in and talks about that we're not under the old law today, and he brings up Abraham and Moses and the 430 years. But the only reason I wanted to come back and mention that one in Acts chapter 7 and verse 6 was what, Janet?
Because it said 400.
Stephen is preaching, and he says the children of Israel were in bondage for 400 years. Do you go, that's wrong?
It's just a guess. I mean, it's just a, you know, it's not like 403 years. I mean, it's around 400.
But were they in bondage for at least 400 years? Yeah. I mean, well, it was 430. Well, it was 400. Okay, Stephen, yeah, as he goes back and he talks about the amount of time that they were actually in bondage, yeah, I don't think you've got a contradiction there as Stephen is going back and recounting the history that
now, if it was 490 years, I would say 500.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't, you know.
Yeah, exactly. But the point was, if he'd have said 450, right, it'd have been wrong. But by saying 400, you know they were in bondage for 300 years. But it was 430. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about, you got 4 minutes, or is that 6? There's a glare up there. We're going to talk about the 10 Commandments. The last question was, first of all, in what chapter do we read about the 10 Commandments?
20.
Now, when you think about the 10 Commandments, I don't know if you've ever thought about them. You can break them up into a couple of categories. Do you know what the 2 major categories within the 10 Commandments are? Any thoughts? What do you think, Jen? Take a stab.
I put down 1 to 4 was about honoring and worshiping God, and 5 through 10 is about the way we should act to be a better person in society, or for our daily lives, focusing on laws that we should obey. It's for us.
Yes. And it was more of the other 6 that you're talking about were more like our dealings with our fellow man.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so you had the first 4 that deal with our relationship with God, and the others with our fellow man, which is really, really important when you think about Christians today and the gospel that we're under. Are we only concerned about our relationship with God? No, we go out of our way thinking, we care about our brothers and sisters. And the point is that if you do love God with all your soul and your might and your heart, if you love God that much, like Jesus said, if you love me, what? You'll keep my commandments. And the commandments is the responsibilities that we have towards one another. And so if a person really loves the Lord, you're not going to be, as far as the Old Testament is concerned, well, let me make this point, since we're on this. And I know we're a broken record on this because we're going through the book of Hebrews. And the book of Hebrews is touching Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which we refer to as the book of law. But we're going through the book of Hebrews, and we've made this point a number of times. Are we under the Ten Commandments?
But yes.
So, Matt, when you tell somebody that, are you giving them permission to commit adultery?
We're not under all of the Ten Commandments, and we're not under the Ten Commandments as they existed then. Like, there are still basically 9 of the Ten Commandments that we still follow and abide by, but that's not because they're Ten Commandments, that's because they're part of the new law.
Right.
The thing that just happens to be missing from the new law is the Sabbath.
The Sabbath, that's
So
right.
no, not commit adultery.
We've illustrated this in our Sunday morning Bible class, like if I have a will and you update your will, or a covenant. That's what this word covenant, old will, testament. You can have I could have a will that I wrote 20 years ago, but if I updated my will last year and I died, which will are they going to apply?
The last one.
The most recent one, right? Now, I could have some things that I repeated from the first one. I could say Debbie still gets everything that I have, okay? I might have some things I designated to the kids that are different, but there might be some similarities. Now, just because they're similar things, does that mean we're going by the first covenant?
No.
No, we're not under that at all. You could burn that one. You could burn. Well, we do. We tear it up. We don't need that anymore when you have a more recent one. And so people need to understand we're not under the 10 Commandments because 9 out of the 10 were mentioned under the gospel. The only one that was mentioned, as Matt mentioned, the only one that was not mentioned under the gospel is worshiping on the Sabbath. When did Christians worship? They worshiped on the first day of the week. Okay? And that's powerful. I mean, people just need to understand the responsibilities that they have of rightly dividing the Word. And this study that we're doing of the Old Testament is just really opening up our eyes to what God expected of the people there. And it's a shadow of things that are going on today of what God expects out of us. And it's just really rewarding for us to know the God that we're dealing with, because the more we read the Bible, remember, this is the mind of God on paper. And there's a lot of people who really don't know God because they haven't listened to what He had to say. They're guessing. They've read bits and pieces, and they really think they know God. They wear this bracelet, WWJD. What would Jesus do? But if you don't know Jesus, what's the sense? It doesn't make any sense, because they'll make up stuff. Oh, I think He'll approve of this, when you really don't know Him. Nancy?
Well, then listen to other people who are more scholarly that say they know more about the Bible, and they may not.
Right.
They're teaching the wrong thing.
That's exactly right. All right. Well, that's it, guys. And so we have covered that. And so next Wednesday, Lord willing. Oh, I shouldn't show you that. But anyway, we're going to be talking about Leviticus. And so, again, I'll run this off right after class. I'll put them at the back, and you'll have question sheets for next week. I appreciate your participation, folks.
You're welcome.
Well, makes you kind of wonder about how valuable material is.
I'll have some.
And it's just plastic.
the fix.
The last question.
Mark case What do I gotta do? Just invitation and another song. One song. This is my face, and the world gonna look at me.
I'm just saying, I'm just getting used to it.
What's the other one?
Who are you? All the years I've known you. I just thought you were available.
It's a surprise for when the scene got back to town. Good evening. If you will, go ahead and mark your songbooks to 23. That'll be the song after Tony gives us the invitation. 23. And now we'll sing 870. 870. I'm happy today. I'm happy today, oh yes, I'm happy today in Jesus Christ. I'm happy today because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm happy today. I'm singing today, oh yes, I'm singing today in Jesus Christ. I'm singing today because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm singing today. I'm praying today, oh yes, I'm praying today in Jesus Christ. I'm praying today because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm praying today. I'm happy today, oh yes, I'm singing today in Jesus Christ. I'm praying today because He's taken all my sins away, and that's why I'm sharing today.
Good evening, everyone. If you would go ahead and take your Bibles and turn to Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. Good to see everyone out this evening in the Bible study, and hope that everything that I say and do here, and of course, is correct and well-pleasing to God. So I'd like to read in Acts chapter 9. Well, I'm going to start in verse 13, then I'm going to jump up to 15 through 22. And this is when Ananias baptizes Saul. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. In verse 15, he said, But the Lord said to him, speaking to Ananias, Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine, to bear my name before the Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel, for I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. And Ananias went his way and entered the house, and laying his hands on him, said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you came, has sent me, that you may receive your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately there fell from his eyes something like scales, and he received his sight at once, and he arose and was baptized. So he had received food, and he was strengthened. Then Saul spent some days with the disciples at Damascus. And then verse 21, Saul's preaching, and he's teaching then. It says, then all who heard were amazed and said, is this not he who destroyed those who called on this name in Jerusalem, and has come here for that purpose, so that he might bring them bound to the chief priest? So in my experiences in life, I've come up with a pretty good thing, because it's happened to me once. It's happened to someone else once. And then I know of another gentleman, and he's not a Christian. But man has a hard time letting go and forgetting and moving on from your past. And I guess it's understandable, because, well, let me tell you a couple of stories. I recently interviewed a gentleman for a summertime position. It wasn't a full-time job, but it was a summertime position. So he succeeded every job qualification that we had. And he was overqualified. But during my interview, and at the end of it, and the interview went really well, and he stopped me and he said, Tony, I just want to let you know, I had a job with this company, and I was very good at my job. But I have a problem. And this problem cost me my job. And over the past several years, I've been doing some odd and end work and just struggling to get by because of my problem. But I just want you to be aware before, and if you would offer me this job, do I have this problem anymore? No. Is it something I struggle with? Yes. But you need to be aware of it before you make this decision. That spoke, for him to do that meant a lot to me. So time passes on, and a few weeks down the road, they say, okay, who would you select? I selected that gentleman because of his honesty and knowing that I've been there. I know. And after me and Trey got out of the military in the early 1990, 91, I was working as a police officer on a Navy base, and I didn't make enough money to live in California doing that. So I would work all night, and then the next day I would work construction till noon. And then I'd go home and sleep a few hours and repeat. That was my life. And then a job came open. And that's this job, it would take care of these two jobs where I just worked one. So I went through and had to take a test, and there was approximately 500 people that were applying for 20 jobs. And I was number 5 out of those 20. I had the job. So they called me and said, the next step in your process is you have to take a lie detector test. I said, okay, that's not going to be a problem. And by this time, I'm a Christian. I've obeyed the gospel. Things have changed for Tony. So I go to this lie detector test, and they hook me up to the machine, and and I'm sitting there, and it's basically a yes or no type thing. So I do the yes and no stuff, and then at the end of it, he starts asking me other questions. And he starts asking me about my past. So I answer all these questions, and I told him, I said, you can ask me anything you want to know. This is a lie detector thing. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm telling you the truth. It's my past. Is it sort of cloudy? Yeah, it's very cloudy. but I'm not that person anymore. So at the end of it, he says, okay, thank you for your time. So I don't hear anything about this job. Well, a couple of months later, the gentleman that gave me the lie detector test came to the Navy base I was working at, and he shows up, and I'm like, hey, what happened here? You know, I was, you know, ranked number 5 in this list. I didn't get that job. You know, I didn't lie on this lie detector test. He said, it's your past. Your past kept you from getting that job. I'm like, you're kidding. He's like, no. I'm like, okay. Of course, I didn't take it real well. But the point of it is, you know, man doesn't look at things like we do. You know, they have a hard time forgetting, and they have a hard time trusting, especially when you're honest and they know about your past. And I understand it, because they may be putting some very valuable stuff into your hands, and they have to rely and trust in you, and that's where they have this problem. So we need to read and understand that no matter how much we struggle through this and have a problem trying to understand why man doesn't allow us to get through, you know, and allow us to move on, we need to read, if you would, turn over to 2 Timothy. And we're going to go to chapter 4. And read verses 7 through 8. It says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. So as hard as we have maybe to struggle with something like this, we need to understand, if we keep the faith and we finish the race, our goal is heaven. And that's what we are here for. And in the last verse that I like to read, it's Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 12. It says, for I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. So that is our shining light. You know, everyone, you know, we all can say that we have, you know, quote unquote skeletons in our closet, you know, and things that may from our past keep us from doing what, you know, we would like to do. And it's a hard pill to swallow. However, we have to keep the faith and to finish the race. And that's our objective here. So if you have yet to obey the gospel or need the prayers of the congregation, we ask that you come forward while we stand and while we sing.
All things are ready, come to the feast. Come, for the table now is spread. Ye famishing, ye weary, come, and thou shalt be richly fed. Hear the invitation, come whosoever will. Praise God for full salvation, for whosoever will. All things are ready, come to the feast. Come, for the door is open wide. A place of honor is reserved for you at the Master's side. come to the feast. Leave every care and worldly strife. Come feast upon the love of God and drink everlasting life. Hear the invitation. Come whosoever will. Praise God for salvation. For whosoever will.
It's good to see everyone out tonight. Thanks, Tony, for the invitation. And good to see Chuck back. Of course, people traveling, people are sick. Any other announcements? All right. If there's nothing else, we'll have our closing prayer. I think it was. Is it David?
Lord, thank you for this week. Thank you for these services. Thank you for the congregation. And please keep David Dickerson in your thoughts. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
See if this fits her.
It's little noggin. Miss Janet's been knit. Look at you. That's a good color. That's a good color.
It may fall apart.